you were a student at first. I was ready to exert my authority. But you're cool. You do, VIP actually.
Okay, everyone, it's time to start class. And just a few announcements and ground rules before we begin. I understand that the notebook, the red notebook, is sold out. Yes, that's a problem. Now raise your hand if you don't have one. Oh, no. Serious? Oh. Did you? Oh my, this is, when did you, raise your hand now. This is really amazing. Oh, I'm very, very sorry about that. Now let's figure out how many people actually went there and tried to buy it and it was sold out, you know. Okay, now how many of those other people just didn't bother, just didn't think about it yet? Just raise your hands honestly so I can just get a feel. Okay. Well, I'll take care of that, and I promise if I had known, I would have, well, what could I have done? I could have printed up online. For now, what are you guys gonna do? For now, just take notes on a regular, those of you who have the notebook, great. Those of you who don't, you're just going to take notes on regular paper, and I will post the notes at the end of today, the notes that we do together. And when you get the notebook, you can copy the notes that will be posted. And where will they be posted? So let me explain. So since so many of you are in this situation, this has never happened before, but what you're going to do is you'll go home, and when tonight I'll post the notes, and here's what I'll post them. You'll just do Stat 100 like you always do. If you want to find out any information about the course, you just Google Stat 100, right? You'll do that and click just on the first link. All right, now where are you going to go if you want to find the lectures? Where would you go? Okay, so you go to Lectures. And then what you'll do is we're going to complete chapter 1 today. So what you'll do is you'll go chapter 1. Well, it's not posted because we haven't done it yet. But I will post it tonight and you will find it there. If you don't find it, if this is what it looks like, then just refresh your page and it will pop up. And I will send you, I'll put in the announcements that it's posted. I'll send you an email too. But check it out, okay? And then you'll see everything, and you can copy it in once you have your notebook. Of course, you're gonna have to wait until the notebook to do that and copy it. You're gonna wait till you actually have a notebook. And I'll send you an email when the notebooks are on the shelves. I don't know how this happened. TIS, everybody went to TIS, right? Whew. Okay, enough said on that. Now, 2 mistakes. One I made yesterday and one some of you made. First, my mistake. Remember when I was going through the syllabus with you and I was talking about the iClicker policy, I said that for the answer to this question, I've already registered my iClicker on Compass 2G for another class. Does that mean it's registered for Stat 100? And remember that I said no here? I said you have to register separately for each class. Well, I apologize, I was wrong. Compass 2G, which everybody's on now, is more efficient with the iClickers, and so you only have to register for one class, and all your classes on Compass will then be registered. You only have to register your iClicker for one Compass 2G class, anyone, and then it will be registered everywhere, even though it might only show up with one class. Like it'll show up but if you went ahead and did what I told you to do, no problem. It's fine. You can it's unnecessary. So you didn't mess yourself up or anything by following my instructions. I just wanted to tell you. Okay? Now, what'd you do wrong? Okay. Okay. I want to establish some ground rules. What you did wrong was you guys, before I was finished, started packing up. And so when I wanted to make a few announcements at the end, some people were unable to hear them. Now, I don't blame you because it's partially on me. I didn't establish some ground rules. So the ground rules are this for when you leave. But before I even do that, I want to explain why. So the ground rules in general for this class are that and I think I said this, but I want to emphasize it, is that it's extremely important. I want you to be engaged. I don't want anybody on Facebook. I don't want anybody texting each other unless it's an emergency, right? Unless, it's a family emergency or something, of course, you could have your phone on for that, and you can respond. But not this chit-chat going back and forth. Even though you're not talking, it's extraordinarily disturbing to people around you. And I just won't have it. And part of the reason we're filming here, you're all being filmed, all the lectures, is we're going to review these films afterwards and see what's going on. See how your social media obsession, that's what's happening, is disturbing the education that you're paying for and actually ruining it for you. I'm looking at this, and among other things, we're filming everything. So I really will know, for one thing, we're looking at you, but for another thing, and you may be asked to leave, because even though you're not talking, and even though you think you're not disturbing other people, you are. You open up that Facebook, you start texting, you start people, it ruins the whole atmosphere. It's very hard to feel like you're engaged in a serious educational endeavor when that kind of stuff is happening around you. And it's the people, it's not me, I can't even tell really when you're on it. From my point of view, I don't know. Because you can open your computer and you can go along and do homework or look at my syllabus. The homework's all going to be posted, sometimes the examples. I don't mind that. That's okay. I want you to be learning, and sometimes when people learn at different, you can go along and think, hey, this is like a homework problem here, and kind of do it along, that's fine. But, and I can't tell, but from the back we can, I'll tell afterwards. And the people around you can tell. If you're looking at the syllabus right now, nobody's gonna say, but if all of a sudden your Facebook page pops open and all this, human interest, all these pictures pop up, it's disturbing. It's disturbing to everybody around you. It's distracting. And I won't have it. So that's ground rule number one. And ground rule number two is it's disturbing if all of a sudden, 10 minutes before the class really ends, or even 5 minutes, people just start packing up your stuff, making all this noise. The class is not over yet until I say it's over. Now, how are we going to, I understand you have to go to another class, and sometimes I understand there's an emergency, and for sure, then you're free to leave, and of course, but I'm talking about this general, what happened last class, if you recall, this general flipping it, everybody getting ready before I was finished. That's not going to happen again, right? And how will you know when I'm done? So let's just establish some just common thing that I'll say, and then you'll know it's over, okay? So you won't misunderstand. And what I really would like to say, what I really mean is I want to say, well, the lecture is over, and what I also want to say is thank you. Thank you for participating. Thank you in general. It's almost like, I know I sound silly when I call myself a statistics preacher. That's what I tell people. But I feel it's almost like a blessing, just an appreciation When I say thank you, it's not only you or the lecture, but our opportunity. And I mean this from the bottom of my heart to just be here at this amazing university and really think about trying to be honest with each other and think about what's important without prejudice, without bias. And when I say prejudice, I don't only mean the type of prejudice that we're all aware of and that we all know is morally wrong, sexual discrimination, racial discrimination, the stuff that we are, but what I really mean is something more than that. I mean, trying the prejudice the bias that we all have, that we walk around with, that we're limited by just because the way our brain functions as human beings, the subjective bias. And this is an opportunity that we saw before. We all prefer number 3. I mean, biases that we're not aware of. Right? All these, and statistics is a whole way of thinking, a tool that isn't hardwired into our brains that we need so that we can discover some kind of truth together. If it's good or bad, maybe it says men and women really have some sexual differences. Just look at it. Let's look at the truth together. I mean, of course we have sexual differences. What did I mean? I was so hesitant to say anything because it's like, you can't say there's any differences in the way we think or anything. It's not politically correct. I don't even want to think in politically correct terms. So it was very hard for me to even say, I'll say it. Like maybe our math skills just aren't as good or something. I don't know. Let's just look at the truth. Let's look at our data. That's what I mean without prejudice. I mean, let's find out some truth together as human beings in a way that we really hardly ever do because people are so afraid of math. And that's what I want to engage in with this class. And it's a rare opportunity for me and for you. And so I really am grateful for it, to just really think about stuff together. And so I want you to tell me if I'm wrong. Absolutely, I'm wrong all the time. And that's why I know I need statistics. I mean, in my gut, what I feel is all the time. I'm being checked constantly, and I think we all need to be, by some common truth, some objective reality that checks us, and that's what we're learning. All right, now, so that said, I want you to always engage. I don't want you talking distracted on Facebook, but I always want you to contradict me if you think that I'm saying something kind of ridiculous, or even if I'm just off or have something backwards, or even if I said the wrong, especially if I write the wrong word, I make an error that could confuse people in the notebook. I want you to tell me. And you'll get extra credit if you're right. I'll give you an extra credit point on the next exam. I mean, it will really add up. Because I don't want to say something wrong and then everybody propagate the wrong idea. I mean, I make a mistake and I wrote something wrong and everybody has something wrong in their notebook. I'm very grateful when you tell me. Okay? And don't just, I spelled a word wrong but if I really say something that could confuse something, I really said something wrong, maybe. I said it right maybe and wrote it wrong, or please tell me, you will get an extra credit point, whoever says it, raises their hand, says it first. I'm serious. It's fun too. Okay, so now let's go to the lecture. And I feel so bad you don't have it. The notes, so we're going to go to the document camera. And chapter 1 on experimental design. Now, you don't have this, so usually it's pretty easy to see, but if you don't have it in front of you, it might be hard to see. So I'm going to try to, whoops. That didn't do it. Okay, I'm going to try to zoom in a little. Maybe that will help. Okay. All right, so we talked about experiments last time. And I'm going to read this more than I usually do because you don't have it in front of you. So it says, experiments are done to see if a treatment has some effect, right? Like, We want to know if something works or not, whether it's an educational method or whatever, or a drug. And so we set up an experiment. Now, if the researcher decides who gets the treatment, then this investigation that we're doing is called an experiment. If he decides, if I decide, or if the researcher decides, as opposed to an observational study. What's an observational study as opposed to an experiment? That's when the researcher doesn't decide who gets the treatment, but just studies the effect of the treatment. The researcher plays no part in choosing who gets the treatment. Then it's called an observational study. Maybe I should just explain this a little more. That's in chapter 2. So maybe a picture would help. So what I'm talking about is, all right, if you have, well, when you don't have the book in front of you, I'm a little bit, I'm not used to this because we're usually all on the same page, and I know you can see it and follow along, and so many of you don't have it, but I'll get the hang of this. All right, so if the experimenter makes a comparison. We said you have to, it's very much common sense that if you want to see if something worked, you want to compare, give that treatment to one group of people and compare them to somebody else. So if you have that comparison group and make some kind of explicit comparison with actual data, it's called a controlled experiment. So if you compare, it's called a controlled experiment, okay? But what, as opposed to what? If the researcher just gives the treatment to a group of students, records the results without making an explicit comparison, it's called an uncontrolled experiment. You might be wondering, well, why would that ever happen? Does anybody ever do an uncontrolled experiment? I mean, it's so obvious. Have a control group. But uncontrolled experiments are done all the time because they're so easy to do. In fact, I'm probably really guilty of doing one in the way I teach. I mean, here's an example of an uncontrolled experiment that I do, that I'm guilty of. We do uncontrolled experiments all the time. Like, here's an example. Okay, so an example of an uncontrolled experiment. There's tons of them, but here's one. Okay. Okay, it basically started in 1999. Okay, in 1999, this is true, let me zoom out a little bit. I tested out these incomplete notes. It was a brand new idea. I'd never heard of it before. And I wanted to see if it would work. I thought, wow, what if I just did this a workbook like this? Because before that, I had been either writing out all the notes, not writing out, old-fashioned way in math, just writing everything on the blackboard. In 314 Alkeld, this huge room with multiple blackboards, just writing every single thing out across the whole, And then PowerPoint came around and I tried that, just all my slides or transparencies, everything written out ahead of time. And then I just came up with this idea, okay? So I thought, okay, I'm gonna test it out. So that's what I did in 1999. It was in a different course, linear algebra. And I wrote up a notebook like this. And I thought, it works so great. So in 1999, I did an experiment. So I tested, this was an experiment, I tested this method, this new educational method called the incomplete notes, which unfortunately most of you don't have in front of you. I tested that. And I thought it worked great. The students all told me it worked great, everything. And I tout this. I tell you, it's the best pedagogical tool I've ever used. And I promote it. I say, it's wonderful. Did I ever really do an experiment? No. I I never did I did an experiment. I say, oh, I tested it out. But did I ever really have a control group? I say I did great compared to other semesters, but that's not a control group. I didn't take data and really try to say, okay, what did I try to match it up to past semesters? Look at how I used to teach and think about actually quantitatively, or as if I was not invested in it, actually did all the numbers and on every variable that I thought was important to teaching, if I compared the statistics from previous semesters to when I started using the notebook and actually wrote it up and looked at it. No, I didn't do any of that. I just have this subjective feeling the way we are, and I know that's biased, and I persist. I didn't do it. I just feel like, oh, I know in my heart this is better. The students all tell me it's better. I love it. Everybody likes it. But come on, I didn't do a controlled experiment. So we're guilty of it all the time. People do these experiments, and it's just so easy to do without any control group. So that's an example. In medicine, it's done all the time too. And it's done because doctors feel like, oh, I've done this great thing. I have this new procedure. But they don't really. It's better than what I did in the past. They're just like what I'm doing now. And maybe it is. And maybe it really is. But they haven't really tested and done a real controlled experiment. So it happens all the time. Yeah.
So can you get concrete data from uncontrolled experiments?
Can you get concrete data? No. Very good question. Can you get concrete data from uncontrolled experiments? No. I don't have any data. I don't say, if I got the data, then it would be a controlled, then I'd have a control. It's a good way to look at it. If I got the data and went and looked at all my averages and then got the data from before I used the notebook, or else decided to not use it one semester with a group of people, and then took the data on them and then made a comparison and said, okay, how do they compare these two groups on these different variables? Then it would be a controlled experiment. And I haven't done that. It's work. It's a lot of work. And it's, you know what? You understand why I haven't done it? Does that make sense to people? Who wants to? I'd have to teach a method right now. I'd either have to go back, and there's so many different ways that I taught when I didn't have the notebook. It was, how am I actually going to compare it? And also, students did really well before I had the notebook. It's not like they didn't do well. I was always, I was a good teacher. I tried. I wanted the students to do well. So it would be very hard because the problem was I couldn't cover as much. I know this, and the students had to spend a lot more time outside of class, so maybe their scores would be about the same. It's really hard to do an experiment. That's all I'm saying. You understand? I've wanted to do it. It's hard. It's just a lot of work. So these happen all the time. So I tested the incomplete notes, but never made an explicit comparison, so I really can't. I'm prejudiced. I like this method. Maybe it's not all that good. I have to realize that. But never made an explicit comparison. Never collected the data. I'll write that. But never made an explicit comparison. I'm going to write what you said. Never made an explicit comparison by collecting the data and actually analyzing it from another semester and from here. Collecting data from another group from a control group, right? By collecting data from people who didn't use the notebook and making a comparison. I can't fit that all in, but you understand? I'll write it up better in the notes I post if you want. Okay, so now a controlled experiment, which is much better, we all know that intuitively, you make a comparison. So the researcher decides who gets the treatment, and that's called the control group, and compares them to those who didn't get the treatment. And that's the control group. All right? So a control group is just a comparison group. That's all it means. That you actually take data on. It's not just, in my head, I'm sort of comparing it the way I'm doing it to before. That you actually take data on. Collect data on, it's a better word, but take data on. You know what I mean? Okay. Now, why is a control group important? I think we all understand this, but the main idea of a controlled experiment is that you want to have two groups as alike as possible. The controls should be as much like the treatment group as possible. In every way, you want the only difference being the actual treatment. You want a clone. You want one group of people and you want clones. Obviously, you can't do that. The only difference being the treatment. That way, when you measure the results, when you look at the effects, if there is a difference in their responses, it has to be attributed to the treatment because everything else is exactly the same. So it has to be the treatment, right? That's the idea. And if you have groups that are different, like I'm comparing using the notebook to past semesters when the whole structure was different, and there's so many different things, it's really hard to know if it was really the notebook that caused people, it's just extremely hard. But if you make the groups as alike as possible, in every way you can, with something like a notebook, it's hard, and with a drug, it's very easy. You can make the groups as alike as possible. You have one group has a drug, the other group has the placebo. You treat them exactly the same. It's very easy. With an educational method or an exercise program or something, it's much harder because people know they're not which group they're in. And things. It's much harder to do. Okay, but you can still do it, and I didn't. That's the problem. I didn't do anything, and a lot of people don't. You can still try to do it. I didn't even try. So the control should be as alike as possible. All right? That way, any differences in the responses of the two groups can be attributed to the treatment and not to some other difference between the group. Does everybody understand that? Why that's, you understand? Okay. Now, I want to emphasize that with an observational study, you can have a control group, you should. You can make a comparison. We should think about this. What's the difference here between, what's an observational study and a controlled experiment? Okay, an observational study, you don't decide who gets the treatment. So if something's harmful, you might want to study something that's harmful, like smoking, or, I don't know, cocaine, I don't know, meth, something, drink, anything like that. You can't, as a researcher, you want to know what happens to people when they take meth, or when they, what happens? What are the effects? You really need to know that, right? But the researcher can't assign people to do that. They can't assign people to smoke. And it's not even necessarily bad things. It's things like, what happens when you live in a really polluted environment? Or, well, that's a bad thing, but not, it's something that either the subject chooses to do, like smoke or drink or take cocaine or whatever, but it's also things that, like, circumstances impose, just happen to people. Like, you might want to study the effect of being in a big family, or being the last born, firstborn, or living in a city or crowded environment. You just might want to, that you can't really assign people to do. And then you still want to study it, so it's an observational study. So for example, if you were studying smoking, which I used to do, by the way. Like, oh, sorry. Remember you said, didn't I tell you that? And like somebody asked where I went to college last time, and I said that I used to smoke there. was it this class? Yeah. Boy, it's been so long. Don't even remember how to do it. But I remember this. Yeah. That would be so weird to like smoke in class. I can't even imagine it now. Okay, anyway, why are we talking about it? Okay, so, all right. So if you want to study the effects of it, you can't randomly, or anyway, not only randomly, you can't say, you're going to smoke for 10, 20 years, I'll see what happens to you, and you're not. And then we'll see how much lung cancer, we can't do that. But obviously we want to know what happens. So that's an observational study. So let's write this down. And so we can be clear that you have control groups in both. So in a controlled experiment, let's just think about this and be clear. In a controlled experiment, not the kind I did with the notebook, but in a controlled experiment, the researcher, the investigator, whoever is doing this, the researcher chooses or chooses what? Who to give the treatment to and who not to give the treatment to, and they're called controls. They say, you're doing this. I'm setting this up. I might set it up randomly, but I'm telling you, these people are good. I'm setting up the conditions. And then studies the responses, the differences, sees what happens, gives the treatment, gives this group the treatment, waits some time, then takes results here, and compares the two. So then compares or studies the effects with actual data. Okay? The responses of the two groups, the effects, the responses of these two groups. Now, that's the controlled experiment. What is an observational study? An observational study is different than this. Let's think about it. How should I draw this picture? Okay, this step's gone. This step's completely gone. So what happens? The treatment just happens. How? Okay. The treatment, and smoking, if we were studying smoking, is going to be called a treatment. It's kind of weird to call it, but we were studying treatment. We were studying smoking, and we'd compare people who smoke, that would be the treatment, to people who don't, and that's the control. But we didn't decide, I don't know how to say this, it just happens. The subjects either choose, like with smoking, the subjects themselves choose, or let's say now, what if we were studying pollution? That's not the subjects really choosing, or we're studying if you were born in a big family or you were the firstborn. That's just general circumstances happening to somebody. All right, so we'll just call it general circumstances or whatever you want to call it. You know what I mean, general circumstances. They didn't really choose to be in a big family, it just happens. So general circumstances choose. Same here. And what happens then, what does the researcher do? Then the researcher, it's the same thing, studies these effects. So the researcher, I'll put it in both, this part's the same. The researcher then compares. Or doesn't compare in an observation, but usually, there's a control group. The researcher, if it's a good one, and the researcher compares. If the researcher didn't compare and just said, I just think smoking's bad for you, I just know it, then it would be like an uncontrolled observational study. That doesn't usually happen. The researcher then studies the responses here, usually with big data sets. Okay, studies the effects. So that's it in the nutshell. And we're going to talk about this in chapter 2, because obviously there's going to be bias here. Subjects themselves are choosing. There's going to be obvious bias. The groups are not going to be the same. But we're here in this chapter. So, all right. Now, just to summarize here. Okay, so now we're in, go ahead. That's a good point. She said, is it a controlled observational study? Let's go back and see. Yeah, thank you. Great. Oh, God, you guys are being amazing. Okay, controlled experiment. And then I didn't say anything here. Shouldn't it be controlled observational study? Very good idea. Okay, yeah, but people never talk of it that way. They just say an observational study, and somehow they just don't put so what we're going to say is this. Observational study, they would say this. Observational study with controls. Okay? That's what this is. I just don't want to give you language nobody uses. So this is an observational study with controls, is how people would say it. It means the same thing. You can think of it as a controlled observational study. All right, thank you. Now, all right. That was good. I'm wondering if I should count that as a mistake on my part. I should have thought of that. Okay, now, all right, types of controls. Another question? Yeah.
Where does a survey fall?
Oh, that's a, gosh. Okay, where does a survey fall in this? Well, it's a really good question because there are going to be a lot of the same rules with a survey that we're using here. Like you want, if you're going to take a survey and you're going to extrapolate to a larger population, you're going to want to make the population and the survey group as much alike as possible, like treatment and control. And you're going to want to use the same rules of randomization, right? Like you're going to want to, because if you just choose, so there's a lot of the same things that apply, but unless it's not really it's not quite an experiment. You could use it as part of an experiment, but it's more like you're doing you're still trying to find something out, usually about a larger population. So in that way it's an investigation, and it's just called a survey actually, and the same rules apply though. That's why it's interesting that randomization is best. It's just that instead of treatment and control, you have a sample and a population, and you want them to be as much alike as possible. Does that help answer your question? Okay, go ahead. Yeah, I mean, I'm so glad you're saying all this stuff because it's exactly what, all right, so his question was, wait a minute, if you observe something, how is that control? You have no control. Why are you calling that controls? You're just observing, and that's absolutely true. You have no control. That's how you should think of an observational study. You have no control. But what is this? Wait a minute, what are you talking about? It's because our language is confusing. We're using the word control to mean different things. That's a problem with the general languages that people use in this field. So think of it this way. We have no control, and that's probably why the language isn't, very good point, that we don't say controlled observational study, because that would be even more confusing. That would mean like we would have control here. No. The problem is we're using this word control when really what we mean is not control. This is what the word's used, but if you want to just like, it's like really, I mean, you can lightly cross it out. Really what you mean is a comparison group. You don't mean control. It's just that's the language people use. And I'm sorry, it's confusing, but that's the language. So it's a really good point. I never thought about it really before. That you really want to say treatment and comparison group. But everybody uses control, so I've used control in two different meanings, and that's why it was confusing. And if I put controlled here, it would be even more, and that's why it's not done. So what we mean is a comparison group. And that's why, so don't confuse those two meanings of the word control. Now that I think about it, it gets even worse later on, because we use it in another context, that same word, control. Thanks. Do people understand now why we call this, how it can have controls? Because we're really just comparing. Do you understand that? Do you understand who asked the question? Helps? Okay, thanks. All right, now, and it's just so basic and important, and no wonder people don't usually understand it. Even researchers get it all mixed up because of all this. Okay, so now, all right, now we have these different types of comparison groups, different types of controls, in designed experiments. We're just talking, this chapter is experiments. So we have different types of comparison groups that we're using in these experiments. We have the two basic different types. We can choose to randomly do it. Once we decide we're going to choose who's in which group, we have two options, two overall options. We can randomly do it, right? Or we can non-randomly do it. There's one way, basically, basically we randomize, and then there's lots of different ways of not randomizing. Okay, so let's go through them and think about them. So, in the pros and cons of each. All right, so if we randomize, all right, the pros are pretty obvious. Think about what our goal is. Our goal is to make the two groups as alike as possible. And we saw that, because you've thought about this before. You knew before even you stepped into this class that random controls were good. You told me, you right away knew that, which is extremely, when I first started teaching statistics, no one knew that. But now, randomized makes the two groups as alike as possible for the major reason that, what? It eliminates bias. It eliminates our subjective bias that we know we have. So it eliminates bias, right? And it's most likely to make what? The two groups the treatment and the control group the same as possible, as alike as possible. On all, the same, as alike as possible on all the relevant characteristics, not just the ones that we think of, but everything that we didn't think of. Why? Because, why? Why would randomization do that? Well, for one thing, it doesn't have the hardwired subjective bias that humans have. It doesn't care, but also, it's because, and this is very important, because random differences average out in the long run. In the short run, if you only have 10 people, it's possible you could have all of one type of person. Let's say you have 5 boys and 5 girls, and you randomly assign each person by the flip of a coin to treatment or control. You could end up with very uneven groups, where there's disproportionate number of girls in one group compared to the other. But because if you did it with hundreds and hundreds of people, you're going to get about 50%, you're going to get about the same proportions of males and females in each group, everything, because random differences average out in the long run. So because random differences average out, that's why, in the long run, as long as you have enough subjects, because random differences are going to just average out, you're not going to get a systematic bias. As long as you have enough subjects. We'll talk about how many is enough later. That is a huge pro. It's basically, these are the best. This is the best you can do is randomization. That's the best. Okay. What are the cons? What are the cons? With a small study, remember we talked about that? With a small study, you'd have to first match people up, because you could get these big accidental differences. Like if I only had, a few people, I would take the 2 boys that were as much alike as possible and flip a coin. At the end, I'd have a random assignment. It would still be randomized. We still call it random. So that's not really a con. The biggest con, it's really hard to do. It's really difficult. Think about if I was going to set up an experiment actually about my teaching method, and then I said, for each of you, I want to flip a coin and decide whether you're going to have this notebook or you're going to have to read some traditional textbook. And pay $150, that's how much they cost, and I'm just going to decide by a flip of a coin which one you're going to do. You wouldn't like that. You wouldn't volunteer for that. It happens all the time, like mammograms. There's never been a randomized trial on mammograms. We don't know if they work or not. There's a lot of, now doctors aren't even, it's a big controversy because we don't really have the data on that. It doesn't seem like doctors are in a quandary about even recommending them to, what age should we recommend them? There's a lot of controversy. There's no randomized experiment. Why? Because you couldn't get women to volunteer because no one wanted to be in the group that wasn't getting screened. We all believed, well, man, why not? I'm going to get the screening. I don't want to get breast cancer. And you couldn't get enough people to say, hey, I'll just be in this experiment, because we had these subjective feelings that we don't want that. You have to really have this feeling that they're equal, that you don't know which one's better. And then allow yourself to be a guinea pig and be in this experiment for the sake of science. And I would volunteer in a heartbeat for a mammogram study because I really want to find out that information, but there aren't enough people, just because I know that but there aren't many people who would do that. So they're hard to do. They're expensive to set up. They're difficult to do. They're the best by far, and everybody knows that. We all say it, but they're really hard to actually do, to set up and everything. Okay, so we'll just say they're just hard to do. You understand? Very difficult to do. Hard to get volunteers. And then can you extrapolate to a different population? Maybe your volunteers are so peculiar, the people who would sign up for such a thing. Maybe you can only apply that to those type of people. There's a lot of problems in the real world doing this. With human subjects, there's not problems in the scientific world. If you're doing in physics or something, that's the only type of experiment they'd ever do. But when we're talking about humans, it's really hard to do. Okay, so hard to get volunteers. It's expensive. It requires an enormous amount of planning. It's difficult. That's why there aren't as many. Yeah?
For randomized, would a con be that the sample size has to be large? You have to have a large number of people?
With the randomized, do we have to have a large number of people? Is that your question? If you just completely randomize, just say, okay, I'm going to put everybody's names in a hat or whatever, or shake them up and take half of them out and put them into treatment, the other half into control. Or just flip a coin or something. Yes, you do absolutely have to have a large sample. Maybe it depends on what you're studying and stuff, but usually a few hundred or something. You should have a large study. Maybe even 100 would be okay. But if you do it that other way, where it's called stratifying first, matching people up first into groups as much alike as possible in a very small study, it's still called randomized, and I'm still putting it, if you then at the very end, with those two people that you match up, you get pairs, you match up, you only have 20 people. So you find 10 pairs, as much alike as possible. And then you flip a coin and decide the final decision of who goes into treatment and control. As long as that's random, it's called randomized.
Would the con therefore be limited?
Would the cons then have to be what?
Limited.
There aren't many cons, really. Theoretically, there's no cons at all to doing a randomized experiment. The cons are more practical, that it's very hard to do. Does that help answer your question? Yeah. There's no theoretical con. We all know it's the best way to do it. It's just hard to actually implement it. Maybe that's the best way I should say it. Thank you. So there's no theory. It's just the cons are all practical, that's hard to implement. It's hard to implement this type of experiment. There's no theoretical reason. There's nothing wrong, And theoretically, it's by far the best. So you'll always be told, oh, it's the best. It's just really, really hard to do, is what I'm saying. And it's hard to do in certain contexts. All right, now we have a zillion types of non-randomized. Historical, we've talked about, let's just look at them. Historical is one, with pros and cons. And then there's the experimenter who tries to match the people up, but doesn't decide randomly at the end. And then there's two more. The experimenter chooses in the best interest, like I think which one's best for you guys or something. And then the experiment says, okay, I'm just gonna let you guys decide. You can go on. These are the major types of non-randomized controls that happen. All right, so let's think about this. They do all have pros and cons. I mean, they have pros. I mean, the historical. Experimenter chooses people to be in the treatment group and then compares them to subjects from the past who didn't get the treatment. Well, this should be done. I mean, you want to look at the data. You have an enormous amount of data from in the past. Let's say a new drug comes along. You want to compare the outcome of some disease before the drug was available. Of course, you use that. You don't ignore it. And it's very easy to do. So it's very easy to do. You don't want to ignore these vast stores of data. But the cons are pretty obvious. Remember our goal. We want the two groups to be as alike as possible. Well, it's impossible for the groups from the past with all these different conditions, historical conditions being different, to be the same as what you're doing currently. There's absolutely impossible. I mean, all these other differences between past conditions and present conditions are going to interfere with your conclusions. The two groups are necessarily going to be different, you know? So let's just write that. And past conditions have to be different than present conditions. So past conditions, the two groups are going to be different. Past conditions are necessarily different, so there's obviously bias. Are necessarily different. Now the question is, so there has to be bias. There has to be this, there's going to be bias. So there'll be bias. The thing is that you don't know which way the bias is going to go. You know, it's just so hard to sort out. Is the bias going to be for your treatment, against your treatment? There's just too many it's just very hard. You're not sure which way even the bias is going to go. Now, how about the experimenter tries to match? I'm really glad we talked about this because, okay, so let's go back to the small. Experimenter tries to match the two groups up as much as possible. We know the con of that is what? What's the con? If I try to make the two groups as alike as possible, what could possibly be wrong with that? What could possibly be wrong? You know it's going to be bias, right? Because I'm choosing, or some human is choosing, right? So we can write the con. So we know that it introduces bias. Whenever humans choose, we'll just write it like this, humans choose, we know there's just going to be bias. And what do I mean by bias? I don't mean necessarily people are prejudiced or racially prejudiced, right? They might be, but what I'm talking about is they have systematic preferences. We all do. It's impossible not to. That won't average out with enough subjects. They'll just increase. You know, with random differences, they'll average out. With systematic preferences, they're just going to get worse with the more subjects you have. So humans choose, whenever you let humans choose, and we're choosing to match them up, you know what I mean? Human choice leads to bias. And what I mean by that is systematic preferences that don't average out. So it's bad. I mean, it's certainly not, we know this is not the right way. Now, why are there so many experiments that are done? What are the pros? What are the pros? Wow, how can I say this? This isn't really a pro. Let's just think back. Okay, so we have the motivation why this always happens where people don't randomize. It happens all the time. Okay, so let's say we don't have the resources to do a big study, and so we know there's going to be these, we don't want to leave it just to the flip of a coin. Who's going to be in which group? because we know, like, you can see what happens if you did that. Let's say you were doing I had a class of 20 people, and I wanted to give one group one, and so I flipped the coin, and I see the results, like, one group is gonna do better than the other, no matter what I do. The more serious students happen to be in one group. I can't do that. So, okay, so I stop and I say, I'm going to try this other method that I talked about before, that I have a small study, so I'm gonna try to randomize them, like your question. Okay, so I'm gonna try to match them up as much as possible. So I do that. And I take the two top students. I'll take the two top students, but I know they're not exactly equal. I only have 20 people, so let's say one top student is so far getting 100%. And the next one is maybe getting 97. I know they're not equal. They're only 20 people, they're not gonna be exactly equal. I can't really match them up. So I flip the coin, so it's a randomized study, and I'm not gonna get drastic differences because the 97 person will be here and the 100 will be there, and I'll do it with the next group. But let's say that I look at the scores of the two groups and I see one group really has an advantage. I put, just by the luck of the draw, their scores, even all of them, are really higher than that group. What do I do now? I randomized. I know that's not right. I don't have enough subjects. What would you do as a researcher? So you fudge things. You say, I'm just telling you how it is in real life. You go, and how you would probably do it, you'd say, I know that's not going to go, so I'm going to even it out. I'm going to really, at that final stage, I'm really going to even them out because I know better. We can't resist doing that. It's so hard to resist doing that. We know it's wrong, but we just can't resist. And maybe it does help. It certainly helps if you're actually gonna, like when I teach you, I'm doing it all the time, and that's good because I'm not really doing a study. I'm actually, trying to teach you. So of course I'm doing, adjusting everything subjectively. But when you want to figure something out really, does it work? And that's what we're talking about here. That's what we're doing, this experiment. Does it work? We don't know if it works. You can't do that. We know you can't do that. Every research, but we do it all the time. We just can't, we can't help ourselves. So it's not really a pro. What is it? It's more of an explanation of why it happens so much, even though we know better. So what I'm going to say is the researchers just can't stop themselves, myself included. We just can't. We say, okay, wait a minute. I know this is wrong. I'm looking at this. I did do the flip of the coin, but I can see the groups aren't equal. And then we say, I'm going to adjust it. Everybody does this. And when you start doing that, you ruin the results. It's really hard. What I'm saying is, in real life, things are messy and you can't always follow the rules. And then all right. Nobody teaches it this way. I don't even know why. You're being so responsive that I'm saying things I've never even taught before. These are never in the notes before. It's sort of surprising to myself. Okay. It is. You'll never see this in any of my notes before. I'm just thinking, okay, I'll tell you really why. Amazing. Okay, so I'm shocked. I've never written this before. So people, what am I going to say? This isn't a pro. What is this? This is an explanation, not a pro. Okay? Explanation of why it happens so much if it's not good. It's not really a pro. So I just want you to imagine being a researcher and what you would do. You can't stop yourself. You just can't stop themselves. Most people can't, and they don't. From somehow we believe, okay, this is the best way of saying it. We can't stop themselves from somehow, and this is when I've done it, somehow thinking that they can overcome their prejudices. That's what I think. I'm not really being biased here. And you know what I mean when I say bias. I don't mean racial, sexual. I'm really trying to help out this randomization. I'm helping it out. I'm making it better. And I can't overcome that feeling that I'm doing that. And then I'm not introducing bias. I'm not. I'm saying to myself, I'm looking at them, these numbers, I'm just going, but you are. You're deciding on this variable, this is what's most important, of course you are. and I can't stop myself, so I'm just imagining, I know other people can't. People can't stop themselves from somehow thinking they can overcome their prejudices. And that's fine, that's good. When you're actually treating people, when I'm actually teaching, that's great to try to accept, but it's not good when you're trying to doing a study and trying to see if something works. You can't do it this way. It's not good. And once you're administering the treatment, you already have shown it's good. Of course you're going to act subjectively sometimes. But not when you're trying to figure it out. So people can't stop themselves from somehow thinking they can overcome their prejudices. Well, that's it. All right. So, is that even clear? People can't stop themselves from somehow thinking they can overcome their biases. All right. First time that ever appeared in a notebook. Now, these. Okay, so the experimenter chooses the treatment and control groups in the best interest of the subjects. There's so much motivation to do that. To think, oh, I think these type of students would benefit from this environment, and I think these would benefit from another. That's a wonderful thing to do when you're teaching. I wish I could do that for each and every one of you. But if I want to just figure out how something works, it's the worst thing to do if I want to do a study. Yeah. The pros for it? What? There were no pros. I had to think, instead I said it's an explanation. I can't think of a pro, except that it's easier to do. That's not a pro. Oh, maybe it is a pro. Okay, it's easier to do. Yeah, because that's what I wrote before. It's easier to do. Yep. Okay, it's a pro, it's easier to do. But it's really not easier to do. Because at the last minute, you could always flip a coin. It's not easier to do. I mean, it's easier just to flip the coin. It's not easier to then look at both sets and then, so I can't even say that. Yeah?
So is the bias in the group that does good, like I'm trying to figure out where the bias is.
That's really a good point. Where is the bias? We don't know. Okay, what am I saying? It's going to influence the results one way or the other, and I don't know which way the bias is going to be. I'm trying to be as unbiased as possible, and I'm just saying it's humanly. What could happen? All right, when I adjust these two groups to try to make them as alike as possible, I really want my treatment to work usually. I'm going through all this effort. I'm thinking of some new educational method. I really hope it works. So once I allow myself a little wiggle room, I'm going to sort of make it, you can't help it, make it a more favorable condition to your treatment. So good question, it's like you're usually biasing it towards the treatment. Okay, yeah?
Wouldn't one of the pros be that by making the groups as similar as possible, you're isolating the variable in which you want to test?
Absolutely, you are. But one of the pros is you are isolating each variable, saying this is important, and making sure the two groups match up. Absolutely, that's true. But at the very end, you make it into it's still a randomized experiment. It's just a stratified randomized one.
And that would be a con. The pro is that you isolated the variable, the con being that it's biased.
Yeah, that's a good idea. The pro is that you do isolate the variable, and the con is you introduce bias. Yeah, we can think of it that way. The pro is that you're more likely to get the groups matched up on the variables that you identify. It's a big pro, actually, because, theoretically, every single experiment, even if it was huge, should be done this way. You should actually isolate these variables. You can't go wrong doing this. Isolate every variable. It's just way too expensive and doesn't matter. If you have thousands of subjects, theoretically, what you should do is exactly the same thing. You stratify, you isolate everything that you can think is important, then match people up. It's very time consuming, and then flip a coin at the end. It just would hardly make any difference. But yeah, okay, we'll put it in. So, okay, so, how do you want to say this? Okay, so this is important, so we'll say, you actually, all right, is it okay if I say this? Like, the notes are going to get too confusing if I like write it on the final print up that everybody, okay? Because it's going to get too messy. All right, now, I'll remind myself, I'll just write isolate variables. And I'll write it up nicely tonight. Okay, now, experimenter chooses a treatment and control group in the best interest. Okay, we're here now. The pros are you sort of, how can I say it? As a study, there's absolutely no pros. As a nice way to be, there's a lot, as a practice, it's a very good way to be. But as a study, there's no pros because you are definitely going to introduce bias. You're going to say, okay, I'm going to operate on these people who I think will benefit from the operation, maybe the healthier people would, and on these people, the ones who might die during the operation or too sick or something, I'm going to use them as controls. You're going to get enormous bias in the direction of your treatment, always. Because you're just going to do that. But that's certainly the way you should practice medicine. It's certainly the way you should, but as a study, there's no pros. It's horrible, and people do it all the time. They mix those two things up. Yeah?
Couldn't a pro be that the subjects are more willing to participate, like agree with what they meant?
It is, yeah. Is that really a pro, though? You're just so, I've seen so many disastrous results from this. You come up with these conclusions. I don't want to say there's any pros, and we'll look at that because you're going to convince yourself of really wrong things. You're going to have, it's just sort of disastrous, and then you're going to propagate these really wrong. So I don't want to say there's any pros. Once you know something works, absolutely do it this way. But as a way to decide whether it works, it's wrong. I mean, you only should investigate things that you really don't know whether they work or not. Not things you've already decided, then use this to like rubber stamp it, get it published everywhere, and then get it propagated when you never found out if it really works. So it's a terrible danger. So I can't say there's a pro, but you're right, everybody likes to do it. Feels good. Feels very good. Okay, as a study, there's no pros. As a practice, it's the way to do it, of course. And it's almost deliberate bias. You're trying to make the two groups different. It's terrible. People mix. As a study, there's no pros. Once you decide something works, of course it's the way to be. You want to do everything in the best interests. It's the best practice. Of course, I wish I could do this with you guys. It's the best practice, but it's the worst studied. If you don't know whether it works, you're never going to find out. Okay, so with the con, you decide that as a study, there's no pros. Once you decide the treatment works, it's the best practice to implement that treatment. That's what I mean. Okay, so the cons are huge. It's deliberate bias. You're trying. You're saying, I'm making these two groups different from the get-go. It just totally contaminates your study, even though it's done all the time. Because you get mixed up. It's really hard not to. You think, oh, I want to help these people. Okay, so this is a terrible way to do it. And what about this? The experimenter decides to let the subjects themselves choose whether to be in treatment or control. It's exactly the same thing. Exactly the same thing. It's just from the subject's point of view. It's really a nice way to be. I'd love to, as a practice, I would love to do that. Once I decide these are really good, that's a good, it's a good way to be. And there's a lot of advantages to it. You have choice, and once I know the two treatments are good and it doesn't really matter which way you go, like if I was a doctor, yeah, give the subject some choice. But if I wanted to see whether something worked, I'd never be able to tell. The people who choose it might be completely different than the people who don't. It would completely bias your study. You'd never be able to figure out if it worked or not. Okay, so it's exactly the same. We'll just say same as above. Same as above, and same as above. So what I'm saying is, these two, you're right, this is okay, there is some pros. So I'm glad you said, these two are okay. I mean, you understand at least, you get results that you can kind of deal with. They're bad, but they're not terrible. These are just, you have to throw these out. These are horrible. Okay, so these are the worst type, and they're done a lot. This is the absolute worst type, and you feel like you're doing the right thing. You feel like it's good, but it's absolutely terrible. Okay, so now we're getting to the point where it's getting time to go. I know you're going to get antsy, and we've had a wonderful discussion, so I'm going to try to think what I can do next to illustrate this. And so what I'm going to do, and I've never done this, I want to just keep on the same thought. So what we're going to do, and I think you understand what the placebo and double blind, I think you can read this and we'll talk about it later. But maybe what I should do, because we have very little time left, is skip all the way to page 7 so I can illustrate some of these so you can believe what I just said here. Okay, and then I know we don't have much time, and you're not leaving till I say you can leave, so it's going to be, how about it when there's like, hello, we'll see how far we get, okay, ground rule, we're not going to finish this, but ground rule when there's 5 minutes left, which is it now? Not quite. This was going to be the ground. 5 minutes left, you just go 5, and I would go, 1 left, maybe just stay for 1, just to give you an idea. So I'm going to give you the idea now. Why don't stop me when there's like 3 minutes left? Can you do that? Because I don't want to keep looking at my watch. When there's 3 minutes left, just go 3, and I'm going to stop, and then I'll wrap up with an announcement. Okay? Just go 3. All right, or just go whatever, because I'm telling you. Okay, so now, all right, so here's some medical studies. Watch this. Let's concentrate with our last few minutes. Medical studies with no controls, like what I did with the notebook, historical controls, and non-randomized controls. And all of those usually are biased towards the treatment. Certainly in the case of my notebook, I think it's great, okay? And if there's going to be any bias, it's going to be in favor of it. Okay, so bias towards the treatment. Now, there's lots of data to back me up, and this is a meta-analysis. There were 51 studies, each with many people, done on this medical procedure. That's a very invasive operation to redirect the flow of blood when people who suffer from cirrhosis of the liver, okay? And they're in danger of dying, they're like really sick. So they did all these studies to put the shunt in to help them, okay? So does it work or does it not? It's a very invasive and expensive experiment, but these people would die otherwise. So are we saving lives or not? Are they very at high risk? And lots of studies have been done. 51 studies, each with many people. All right. Now, there were 32 of them, 24 plus 7 plus 1, that had absolutely no controls, that operated on my notebook principle. It's going to be good, it's going to work. And they didn't bother. I know I'm saving lives. And of them, I just divided them into, these are all published, they were very enthusiastic about it. They advocated other doctors to use it, so that's 75%. Why do you think the note were the most, okay, let's just examine this. Then there were how many? 10 plus 3 plus 2, 15 studies done where there was controls. They explicitly compared, but the doctors decided who was going to have this procedure and who wasn't. They decided. They looked at the patient. Oh, you're healthy enough. I think you're going to make it through. Maybe you guys, these are all my patients right here. You guys, even though you're suffering from this, you're really healthy and strong. I want to operate on you and extend your lives. You guys here, sorry, it's just too risky for me, all of you. I'm afraid I'm going to lose you on the operating table. I just can't. Just live out the rest of your days, you know. I don't want to do this to you, okay? You're going to be the controls. That's what it was. And people do that all the time. Okay, that's how it happened. So then they look who, you know. Okay, so that was 10 out of the 15, 2/3, markedly enthusiastic. Now, randomized controls, only 4 of them. It's really hard to do. Exactly the same thing. You people, all right, I think you could benefit. Now what am I going to do? I'm going to put all your names in a hat, shake them up, and draw out half of them. Or, you know, flip a coin, same thing. And I'm going to operate on half of you, and the others I'm not. And I'm going to compare you two, because you're going to be really alike. How many people, doctor, you know, that's a randomized study. Okay. All right, so I'm going to end it right there. Good voice. You can do that. You'll be assigned that role. All right. No. Roll. Not over till I say it's over and say, okay, say grace. All right. So, wrapping it up, what I'm telling you is I am going to, this is important, I'm going to send you an email. Expect it. No, don't make a noise. Really, we're saying grace here. We are. And so that's what's going to happen. Now I want everybody, now this time, I really appreciate, I'm serious. I want to thank you hugely. I want to bless the class, okay? It's over. You did the survey? Yeah. It's kind of fun, right?
Right, we'll be able to do the homework covered in lunch.